Okay, well, I mean, as I said, if you guys have questions about something I say or terminology, just feel free. I used to teach high school, so raising your hand is like a thing that won't freak me out. Or you can just talk like an adult, that's also cool. So Thomas Reid is a little known philosopher. We do love him around here at Gutenberg. So if you're Gutenbergian or have been around the Gutenberg community for a while, you may have heard of him more likely than if you've heard of him somewhere else. Thomas Reid was a really influential philosopher until he wasn't. Um, so one of the most important Supreme Court, well, one of the first important, some would say, Supreme Court case, Chisholm versus Georgia. James Wilson, one of the justices, in his opinion, cited Reid, and he said, in order for us to come to correct jurisprudence, we first have to come to correct judgment. And in order to understand judgment, we need to look no further than what Dr. Reid has set down in his principles, Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense, which is the book we're going to talk about today. But one of the Chisholm versus Georgia is considered by many to be the first important Supreme Court case. There were others, but this is the one that sort of made a major declaration. And I'm not going to talk about it very much, but if you want to hear about it, what it actually entailed, we can talk about it when we get to the section that has questions. We also know that Adams and Jefferson would just casually drop Dr. Reid's name in letters to each other and not bother to explain who this guy was or what he thought, and they thought very highly of him. So he was very influential sort of at the beginning of the American founding. We also know that a lot of antebellum debates right before the Civil War would use language that Reid used. They would talk about the common sense of the text says that, we shouldn't have slaves, or any person with common sense knows that this means that we should have slaves, and so on and so forth. So there was not a consensus on what common sense ended up meaning for Americans, but they all bought into this idea of common sense as they understood it. But after the Civil War, after a conflict that wasn't resolved earlier by people talking to each other, pragmatism became the dominant American philosophy. So Reid was very popular. He was very influential in our politics and in the formation of the American government. And he was just part of everyday conversation. He was part of the language that we used. But our inability to sort of use him, or at least use what people thought of him, to avoid the Civil War, led to adopting something like pragmatism, since that would, the hope was they could avoid future conflict in that way. I think that we've never really given Reid's philosophy the as they say, the college try. We've never really sort of embraced it. The version of common sense realism that America adopted was more like intuitionism. It's like, I feel like this is right, so that's common sense. And that's not what Reid means by common sense, and hopefully I can clarify that for you as we go on tonight. But we've never given that a try, and we're now in an age where we can't talk about things in common. And what Reid was hoping to do, at least in the inquiry, was to look into how the human mind works, and by understanding that, be able to develop a science of the mind, and then hopefully that could affect how we talk to each other, how we think, how we appeal, etc., etc. So I think that Reid is important in the history of philosophy because he's a very cogent thinker, but he's been left sort of back there, and I think recovering Reid would be a very important step to us being able to have sort of a healthy intellectual life, particularly as Americans, because it's something that did inform sort of the beginning of what we were doing. So before we can talk about Reid, we need to understand the problem that he saw in the world and what he was trying to address. And that's this thing called the theory of ideas. Okay? So I'm going to draw a lot of profiles. There's a nose, lips, okay, chin, neck. Okay? Everybody follow? People, the high schoolers would make fun of my drawings, you know. So, all right, so here's a person, mongoloid as he is. Wow, that's a really offensive term, isn't it? As misshapen as his head is. Okay, so what happens when a butterfly is out there in the world is I have my brain, right? And I see this butterfly, and this butterfly leaves an impression on my brain. So here's my impression of the butterfly. Okay? So what I'm actually dealing with when I am sort of in my own mental space, when I'm dealing with my own mind, is I'm dealing with this mental thing I've created in my mind called the idea of this butterfly. I'm not actually interacting with the butterfly. Okay? The butterfly may have caused this to come into my brain, but I'm not interacting with this, I'm interacting with this. Okay? This is the basic, sort of super simplified idea of the theory of ideas. Okay? And Reid saw that this was going to be a problem. There were all sorts of conclusions and things that philosophers were reaching because of this theory of ideas that he wanted to question and thought they were problematic. Okay? And we'll talk about some of how he critiques those later on, but I want to give some issues that come up related to this theory of ideas. So the first thing that comes up is this notion of cogito ergo sum, which is Descartes' famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Okay? Descartes had this issue. I'm looking out and I see a thing. His example is I see a trench coat, right? A trench coated figure. I guess that's his belly. And this, right? So there's a trench coated figure. He's threatening. Here, I'll give him angry eyebrows on the back of his head. So he's very threatening, right? And the question is, how do I know that this is a man walking around in a trench coat, or his word is automaton, right? How do I know that that guy is not a robot just walking around? And you sort of, if you take this question sort of seriously enough, you can start to ask, well, what do I know for sure? If I don't know that that guy out there isn't a robot, how do I know that everything that I see is what it actually is? How do I know that even I exist, right? So you back the question far up enough, and you get to the question of your own existence. And Descartes' solution to this question is this idea of, I think, therefore I am, right? Regardless of the content of my consciousness, says Descartes, I have consciousness. And so even if I am doubtful that my consciousness is representing something true, it's still there, and I can't argue with that. So this is, for Descartes, certain grounds for believing in his own existence. Reid's going to have an issue with this that we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so for Descartes, who's one of the main proponents of the theory ideas, we need to think of these two issues. The cogito ergo sum issue and the angry robot on the back with angry eyebrows on the back of his head. Okay, so we have those two issues. Locke, who's another philosopher in this tradition, has this idea of comparing ideas. So if Logan is sitting over here, right, I have an idea of Logan, right? I'm not going to try to draw, well, I mean, it would be like a beard and a hat, right? So here's my idea of Logan, right? there. How do I know that Logan is in fact sitting right there now? Well, I take my idea of Logan. What happens is I take my idea of Logan, I take my idea of sitting, I take my idea of now, and probably some other ones. It's not important that we get all of this. Locke doesn't intend to nail all the specific details down, but I have all these different ideas, and I combine them all, and then I get Logan is sitting there now. Okay? So I've called this the comparing of ideas issue. All right. The final philosopher that Reid was responding to was Hume. And if you read the inquiry in sort of its original, there are some adaptations, or it's been, what do they call it? It's been abridged. They will just call him Hume. But all throughout the book, he calls him the author of the Treatise on Human Nature, because Hume had published that book anonymously. And so Reid is very respectful of Hume and just continuously calls him that. I find, in fact, as an aside, that Reid's very respectful of the people that he talks to. He will often talk about the genius of the various people that he's about to critique before he rips their arguments to shreds. But he's very respectful in doing that. So I'm going to call him Hume for the sake of convenience, even though in the inquiry it's he's called the author of the treatise. So he has two ideas. The first is that he has the only thing in existence being ideas and impressions. And we need to do a little bit of a thought experiment to sort of understand what Hume is thinking here. Okay, so imagine we've pulled, it's over there. Imagine we've pulled down a screen on which we're projecting a bunch of pictures, okay? And that screen is your mind, okay? So what happens in your existence is not that you're interacting, you're like in a room and you're interacting with something and then something happens and that causes some other thing to happen. His example is always a cue ball and some other billiard ball. Can we all hang with that? Is that a sinful, can we talk about that? So you've got your cue ball and your 8-ball, and what it seems like is happening is you hit the cue ball hits the 8-ball, 8-ball goes in the pocket. But here's what Hume says. Okay, imagine this is not what Hume says. This is me summarizing Hume by means of a colorful illustration. Imagine you were sitting at a coffee table and you had a coffee table book of pool games. Okay? You could have a shot of someone lining up the cue to the 8-ball. Then you could have a shot of the cue ball hitting the 8-ball. Then you could have a shot of the 8-ball leaving the cue ball. You could have a shot of the 8-ball going into the pocket. And have all of those shots be from different games. Right? This is in fact what we do to make movies, is you film something, you film the exterior of some building, right? And then you go to the interior, which is actually not an interior, it's a set that somebody built somewhere. But your mind wants it to be connected. And Hume says that's what happens all the time. All of your experience is just you having stuff happen to you, okay? It's just frames, okay? And it's your mistake, it's your sort of habit of mind for putting all those frames together and saying that they have some kind of logic to them. You don't know that, right? Like if someone were to hit you in the face with a baseball bat, you just have frame, 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 pain, right? But how do you know that those things are connected? You could just spontaneously get a headache and that didn't come from somebody hitting you with a baseball bat, right? So all that exists are ideas and impressions. So we have that screen, and these images are coming up on the thing. But now imagine somehow that those images keep happening and there's no screen. Okay? So you don't have a mind, because what do we mean by that? We mean that you are somehow the same person as the person you think you are or whatever. All you've got are these successive frames of existence sort of happening in front of you. Okay? So this is Hume's statement of the idea of impressions and ideas. Okay? And it leads to this idea that impressions and ideas are subjectless. Okay? There is no subject, there is no you, there is no me taking that in. There's just a succession of experiences. Right? For all Bob knows, I'm a figment of his imagination. Right? And I'm not an actual person over here. I just, for whatever weird reason, right? Hume doesn't offer any sort of like unconscious or anything, and I don't know that that would be within his system. There's just stuff happening, and you're just witnessing it. But you're not witnessing it because you're not you. Okay? All of you thinking of you is more stuff that's happening that you start to associate with yourself. But that's just a habit, okay? You got to get out of that habit. Okay? So this is Hume's idea. Yes.
So was Hume a metaphysical naturalist?
Yes, he was. Yes.
Does that explain his position on the existence of that person?
Hume is trying to be as scientific as possible in his sort of perception of it. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, I don't think that he would arrive there, right? He gets at it by saying, okay, what are we sure of? We're sure of these frames of experience happening. Okay, so any sort of thing where I say, okay, given these frames, I must be something observing the frames. It's like, why? I see an arm, right? I feel a feeling like the arm is attached to me somehow, but the me is somehow, right? So you get into these, you kind of start with where he's coming from, and you get this sort of weird, okay, like I can kind of get there and kind of see how he's sort of doing that. Okay? Okay, so these are all theories or sort of tenets that come out of this theory of ideas. Okay? If all we have are these ideas in our mind, ideas and impressions in our mind, then we end with these particular issues that Reid addresses specifically. Yes, Logan.
Context question. It sounds like these guys are suffering what I would call an existential crisis.
Uh-huh.
And they are trying to solve the existential crisis because it scares them
Uh-huh.
that they might actually exist or that they might not actually exist. Kind of
Yeah.
feeling here. His boss would say, "Worry about it later. Get back to work."
Sure.
And not even think for a second
Sure.
that he wasn't there or that
Yeah.
himself wasn't there. But why was this so important?
Yeah. I think the origin, I mean, so let's take the robot thing, which is the silly thing, and let's take it to an actual thing, right? Science for ages has been telling us that the sun goes around us, right? For ages. And then Newton comes along, and like, he's the final sort of nail in the coffin that says, actually, guys, we're going around it, and you're just confused because your perception of it is wrong, right? So this is a big issue, right? We were wrong for so long. How do we avoid being that wrong, right? If we were wrong about silly stuff, right? How do we know that we're not wrong about, robots running around in trench coats, right? Or our own existence, or the fact that we think of ourselves as selves. Is that valid? The Copernican revolution really throws this huge wrench into how people are thinking about the universe, and it really does, I think it really does precipitate this way of thinking. We have to come up with a way where we're not going to be wrong. Do I need new batteries? Cool.
Go ahead. But these guys did not grow up in a obvious, oh my gosh, how much more I could go on about.
Right.
But this existence question, self-existence question, seems to be almost evidence of mental illness. No, seriously.
Sure.
I could see dealing with a patient in a ward,
right,
whose manifesting symptom was, do I exist or not?
Right.
And that could be ruining your life.
Yeah.
Because they've
Sure. Let me talk about that. Okay. Bob, did you have a question? Can we get the mic over to Bob?
So I'm woefully ignorant of much of these philosophers' viewpoints and frameworks of thinking, as well as the chronology. But it sounds to me like Hume, even to talk about ideas and impressions, necessarily involves a subject. So it sounds like he's denying Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
But to even have the idea of an idea means that you're there.
Yes. And this is going to be a lot of Reid's critique.
Okay.
So we'll get there when we get there.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So in order to deal with this theory of ideas, Reid sets out in the Inquiry on Human Understanding and the Principles of Common Sense to try to establish the groundwork, not actually finish it, just start doing the groundwork for a science of the mind. Okay? He says in one place, look, I'm not going to be able to finish this project. It's a huge project. It's really difficult. It's really hard to do. All we can do is sort of get as far as we can without making huge errors and being diluted. And then we can sort of lay he uses the metaphor of the string through the labyrinth. And we can just lay the string there, and maybe somebody will be able to pick up the trail and get the rest of the way out of the labyrinth. Okay. These philosophers have come along and they've started working on trying to develop a science of mind, right? Descartes is sort of the first person to come along. He's like, okay, I'm going to think about this. How does my mind work? And the way that he goes about it, he ends up with this theory of ideas, the cogito, etc. Locke comes along and Berkeley comes along. Berkeley's another one. Berkeley doesn't have any specific things that I want to talk about specifically, but he's another person that Reid references a lot. Okay. And each of, Descartes' project is hopeful, right? He wants to get to a place where we can eliminate error. He has a book called On the Principle of Method. Is that what it's called, Chris? On Method. It's in Latin, so whatever I say is probably right because on Method, where he's talking about how not to commit errors. Right? That's what he wants to do. He wants to figure out how are we thinking about things so that we can sort of reason our way without committing errors to sort of a sound way of thinking about the world. And Locke comes along and has the same project, and Berkeley is, Jack talked about Berkeley last week. Berkeley is the Bishop of Cloyne, and he wants to salvage religion from the attacks that some of these ideas sort of lead to, right? You get these Humean sort of ideas floating around, and Berkeley's move is to go, okay, well, there isn't a material world because we know that leads to all sorts of problems and paradoxes. So we just get rid of the material world and make it all in your head and in God's mind, and that resolves the problem, okay? And each of these, Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley, are positive in what they're trying to do. They're trying to salvage Berkeley, very specifically, Christianity, or at least sort of the tradition that they're coming out of, science, etc. They're trying to salvage those things from the skepticism that's sort of inherent in Reid's mind in the theory of ideas that they're working out of. Hume comes along and he just wants to follow this thing as far as he can, and he is also an atheist, and so he is not afraid to abolish certain things that the other people, at least Berkeley, out of reverence, sort of wouldn't try to touch. Reid's idea, though, is, look, all of these people have this theory of ideas, and they're coming at this problem, and it's leading to skepticism. And the problem is that their conclusions are at odds with common sense. And hold that there because I'm going to define it in a second. They're at odds with this idea that he has of common sense. And if philosophy leads to, it ends up being nonsensical, if it's not within common sense, I don't want philosophy. I want to just, he routinely refers to common people as the vulgar. He's like, let me live with the vulgar, and I throw away philosophy, right? But he thinks that what's happened is we have this wrong-headed set of premises, and that's how we've got to these conclusions. And he thinks that philosophy can be salvaged from these sorts of contradictions and paradoxes, and he's going to do that by proceeding on the principles of common sense. So what is common sense? So common sense is not, as is typically talked about, one way that we use the word is folk wisdom. It's not folk wisdom. It's not, I feel that this is right, so that's common sense. Common sense is that complex of things that make up how we interact with the world, okay? So sensation would be one of the things that make up our common sense. Healthy human beings see, hear, smell, taste, touch. Healthy human beings have memory. Healthy human beings can imagine things. Healthy human beings have what Reid calls power, which is like the ability to actually execute what you're thinking, right? If someone is paralyzed, they don't have power, right? They can't. They might make the mental effort to move their arms or legs or whatever, but they don't have it, right? Healthy human beings do have that. They also have volition. So there's a bunch of different factors that sort of make up common sense that we sort of take for granted and are basically how we operate. And we don't really think about them until we're doing philosophy, and then we sort of take them for granted or ignore them. I want to give you a couple examples of sort of recent things in what's happened, recent articles that I've read that are sort of touching on this idea of common sense. Hopefully it'll elucidate some things for you. So I read an article on Facebook, this was probably a couple of years ago now, about a guy who couldn't image. He couldn't make mental pictures of things. And he had gone through his whole life, and he had figured out ways to compensate for this. Or for him, it wasn't compensation. It was just normal. It's just normal operation. But he read an article about a guy who had had severe brain trauma, and they'd done surgery on the guy with severe brain trauma, and everything was fine except that the guy could no longer make mental pictures. And the kid goes, we should be amazed that he could have done this in the first part. And he started running around to his friends and saying, hey guys, this guy used to be able to make mental pictures. And they're like, what are you talking about? And he realized that he'd gone through his whole life and not realized that this was something that like people do normally, and that he had just sort of gotten by without being able to do that. Okay, so he was missing that piece of common sense, but it was fine. Like he couldn't do art apparently, but he could do like math for some. I don't understand that because I have to do math visually, but whatever. So he the way that his mind compensated for that lack was such that he could live a relatively normal life. Another example of someone who was sort of missing common sense, but who sort of could live a normal life and sort of was Dr. Saunderson, who was actually a huge influence on Reid. Dr. Saunderson was a very skilled mathematician. In fact, he was one of the leading experts on the geometry of perspective, right? So how when I move around the room, the geometry of how I'm perceiving the chair, how that's going to change. And he was blind. So he was able to conceptually understand how visual geometry worked without having ever experienced vision in his life. So he could get around his own blindness, right? He couldn't know what color was, for instance. He couldn't ever experience color, rather. But he could conceptually sort of, he would talk about thinking through problems in his own way, right? People would try to do demonstrations and they'd use sort of visual things and he'd be like, no, just let me think about it for a second. And he would go about it in his own way. And he could conceptually come to see sort of the self-evidentness of certain geometrical proofs without ever having to look at or manipulate visually sort of mathematical truths. There's one final example I want to give of people who have sort of a defect of common sense, which is a little more tragic. I read a couple of years ago about a woman who apparently this is a diagnosable condition, who thinks that every person she knows is an imposter wearing a perfect mask of the person. So apparently we have some principle, as Reid would say, some principle of our constitution or of our nature that takes your face and goes, that's Carol's face, right? And that's Carol, right? It matches what you look like to you. And for whatever reason, in this woman, that was broken. And so she went around seeing the people, and they looked like the people that she knew, but she knew that they weren't who they actually were because her mind was broken in such a way that she couldn't make contact between the identity of the person and who they were. So some of these things are way more specific than like memory, right? That ability to connect someone's face with their identity is a really complicated sort of thing. And Reid doesn't try to enumerate all of the things that make up common sense. He just has this idea, right? However it works, we end up doing things in this way or that way, right? We end up identifying people by their faces. And sometimes, just by like the back of their head or whatever. We're really, really, really good at doing that. But it's through how we're built as understanders of the world that we end up doing that. Okay, so now I want to take us through some of what Reid's doing in his inquiry into the human mind on the principle of common sense. So the way that Reid starts is by talking about how we are actually going to study the mind. How are you actually going to study the mind? Well, in Reid's opinion, the only right way to end up doing science is through observation and experiment. You can't just decide how something works and then say that's how it works. You have to actually go and look at the thing and see how it works. Now, this is difficult in the case of the mind because, first of all, you only have one subject, right? The only mind that you really can look at is your own mind. And secondly, it's hard for you to reflect on the operations of your own mind, right? Your mind is constantly just doing that thing where you match Carol's face to Carol, right? And it's hard to sort of step back and go, okay, how I actually do that. And so it's difficult to figure out what all of those principles are that make up common sense. But there are several things that we do know that we do, and this is how Reid proceeds, and he's going to go about examining the 5 senses. Okay? And he's going to start from the simplest of the senses and move his way up to more complex senses. And I'm not going to make an argument for why they're more or less complex, but he goes in this order: smelling, taste, hearing, touch, sight. Okay? So the way that he's going to work through our principles of common sense, he's going to work through the 5 senses, tell us what we can observe about ourselves as we engage in these 5 senses. Okay? So, I'll just say before I actually address each of these senses, in each of these things, he spends quite some time, and I really do recommend that you read this book because it's delightful. He's so good at writing. And through various versions of this draft, of this talk, basically what it sounded like was me just taking the book and like reading the next paragraph and just doing that continuously, and that's no way to like get anywhere. But he has such great things to say that I really do recommend you read this book. But one of the things he does that is some of his best writing is he talks about how our perceptive centers are connected to the structure of our bodies, right? So when we smell, we have to take in the air that's like holding whatever it is that we're smelling, and it's very like nature clearly designed, or God clearly designed, it depends which he uses. He just means, by nature, he just means whatever God has made. Clearly we have been made in such a way that breathing and smell complement each other really well. Clearly, we have the taste center right before the rest of our digestion so that we can enjoy, or we can find that something's noxious, right? We can prevent ourselves from taking in something that's poisonous or whatnot. So he spends a lot of time praising those things. I'm not going to do that for each of those. I'll just note he does, and you should read it because it's really nice. Okay, so here's a rose. Actually, it's some other kind of flower because I can't. Okay, so here's the flower. All right. So science tells us that there's some kind. So science tells us that he calls them effluvia, right? There's little things coming off the rose all the time. And here's my misshapen head person again. All right, here's my misshapen head person. And so when I smell this smell, right, I have some sensation in my mind, right? We've all smelled stuff. Smell is this very particular thing that happens that I perceive, right? Well, one of the things that we notice about this thing we're perceiving in our mind when we perceive stuff is it's nothing like this or like this, right? He says, does a smell, meaning this thing that happens up in here, does a smell have extension? Does it take up space? No, it does not. That is a ridiculous thing to say, right? So, I have this thing in my mind, right? I have this experience, I have this sensation, which is different than the stuff out here. If I smell a smell, I know that I am not producing it, right? I can't on cue smell the smell of a rose. There has to be something that causes the effluvia or whatever scientific mechanism you want to explain how smells get out there in the world. There has to be something causing a smell for me to smell. Now I want you to notice some ambiguity in language here, okay? There's this, the classic cartoon drawing is this, right? Smell, okay? There's a difference between this thing, which we call a smell, and this thing, which is the internal experience I have when I smell something, okay? So I can say, I smell a smell, and that is a meaningful sentence in English, okay? But notice that I use the same word to describe two different things. All right. Now, when I smell something, I believe that it is there. Okay, so ignore this. I just believe that I have a sensation. Okay? I can't contradict, like I can't gainsay my own belief in the sensation. Reid has this very, it borders on funny. He says, if you ask me how I know that I smell something, is I smell it. I can't tell you anything else. I have no one has any better reply for saying that knowing they smell something than to say, I smell it. Okay? He also notes that if we smelled something yesterday, I can bring to mind, right? We call this remembering. I can remember the smell that was smelled yesterday. Okay? And if you ask me why I believe that I smelled something yesterday, all I can say is, I remember it. There's no other thing. I can't reason my way to arguing that in fact, right? So this brings us to one of the issues that came up earlier. Locke's idea of comparing of ideas. In Locke's model, how do I know that I'm smelling a smell right now? Well, I have this idea of now and existence and this idea of smell, and I compare those things and I go, yep, they're similar. So there you go. I believe in a smell. And Reid says, that doesn't help any. I say I smell it, and I think I know what I mean when I'm saying that. And what you're saying is that, what you're saying doesn't help me understand that any better. You're just saying it's like I think he uses the word circumlocution, right? You're going around in circles trying to explain something that I don't need an explanation for, right? I don't need you to explain to me what's happening when I smell something. I don't need you to argue me into believing that there's a smell. I already believe it. It's part of the whole mechanism. All right. Yeah. Right? I remember it. It's part of the whole mechanism. Did you have a question, Logan?
Locke has to have a time reference in that debate to distinguish between remembering a smell and having a smell.
So it's dependent on how you do it. So in Hume, and I'm not sure, and I can't say for sure. You'd have to go read Locke. Hume's idea is that you have the impression, right? You have this thing like slam into your noggin. That's not your noggin because you're not a you, right? Okay? You have this thing. Okay, so if you remember something, what happens is, if you think about it, you can't ever visualize the thing as vividly as when it's right in front of you, right? So in Hume's idea, you just have a faint, you have a faint idea of the thing, okay? And that applies for impressions, smells, sights, so on, as much as it does for ideas. Now, I didn't write this up here, but we'll talk about it. Reid has a bit of an issue with that way of thinking about things. He says, okay, so Apparently, if I believe something really strongly, I have a lively idea of it. Okay? So let's say that I believe in an afterlife. Okay? I have a vivid idea of it. Okay, now we have somebody who's sort of indifferent. So they have a faint idea of it. Now I have somebody who believes there is no afterlife. What kind of idea do they have? Is it a lively idea? It turns out like love is just a matter of indifference or a matter of hate. They're just part of the same thing. That's not how it works, right? Remembering is a totally different process from sensing. Is a totally different process from imagining, right? Because when I imagine something, I'm just picturing it without believing in existence one way or another, right? Belief, memory, imagination, sensation, they're all things that we know what they are and we sort of take for granted, but we couldn't define them and we couldn't argue for them. And that's what he means by common sense. You can't argue to these things. They just are. And you can't sort of sit somebody down. Okay, don't freak out, but you're going to have mental pictures, right? How many of you had that talk from your parents when you were, right? Nobody, right? Because it's just how you navigate the world. Nobody sits you down and says, okay, right? You're gonna think of things from the past. Don't freak out. It's gonna be fine. This is a normal thing, right? Nobody had to tell you that. You just do it. Yes, sir.
Is this the kind of thing that
Modern philosophers talk about, and they refer to it as properly basic beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there is a difference between a properly basic belief and what Reid means by common sense, in that certain things are processes, so I don't believe, right? I don't believe in the process, I just do the process. I think I'd make a distinction there. But yeah, like I can't, so if we think about Descartes' cogito ergo sum, he says of Descartes, and Logan was getting ahead of us here, right? He says of Descartes never believed that he didn't exist for a second, right? He said that he did, but he didn't. Because if he had, we would have put him in an institution. But we didn't do that because as soon as he was done with his thought experiment, he went on believing in his own existence, right? So it's the principles of common sense are basic beliefs. You can't get around them. Why do you believe that you smell the thing? Because I smell it. I have no other recourse than that I am healthy and I am doing the thing. Okay. So, all right. So we talked about the difference between a smell and a smell. This is going to be important. This holds true of most things, right? If we had I don't know how to visually, cartoons don't have like a visual representation of taste. They have to do that thing where it zooms into the guy's eye in Ratatouille and then he thinks back to his childhood when his mom made him that food and then, right, they don't have like a line thing, right? But the same thing holds for taste and taste, okay? There is a difference between this thing going on in my head, going on in my mind, when I taste something, and the actual thing out in the world, whatever it is, that's causing the taste. He says, furthermore of taste, that everything I've said about smell so easily applies to taste that I'm not going to rehearse it because it'd just be repetition. So much for taste. Let's move on to hearing. Hearing, every time I read this section and read, I am just amazed. Because if you think about hearing for a second, you only hear things in one place, in your ear, right? However the mechanism of your ear is tied to your mind, there's only one place you hear stuff. And yet, because you have spent a lifetime hearing things, you can hear something happen and you know where it is. You are so adept at tone changes and all of the little sort of things that happen in the air that affect that tone that you can echolocate, even though you're only hearing it in one place. I think that's like so incredible. I think that there should be what? Oh, sure, fine. Well, there's only one, right? There's only the one place. But yes. So I don't, when I hear his constant example is a coach passes in the street. Okay? Tells you how old this guy was. When a coach passes in the street, I know it's in the street. Even though I'm not in the street, right? Like somehow I've just heard sounds my whole life enough that I can judge where something is by the sound that it makes. Now, sometimes, you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, where is that coming from? And this is something that Reid notes about all of the sensations. If you have a sensation, you think that it's linked to something. There's some cause of it, right? Where is that flower? Where is the coach, right? If you can't see it, you are agitated until you can resolve where the thing is. And you go looking, you're like looking around trying to find it. And he says, this is just part of how we're made. We just want to not be agitated by not knowing where stuff is coming from. But notice, we assume it's coming from somewhere, right? So if you have this idea of ideas and impressions, if you're Hume and you're like, it's just the frames, right? There's nothing causing anything else. It's just frames. Why do I get so agitated? Why do I need to find out where the rose is or where the sound's coming from when I hear something or smell something that I don't know where it's coming from? All right. So as an aside, on hearing, there has not been enough, like we will get to a point, I think, maybe if it could ever be lucrative, where people will figure out how to customize sound for, like, now in movies we just have it's everywhere, and that's enough of an illusion that we sort of buy it. But I'm the prospect of people being able to develop tones that are so perfect that you think something is maybe that'd be too weird. Maybe you'd just constantly be looking around for whatever was happening. But the fact that you do that is just, it's like mind-boggling to me. Except it's not, because it's exactly how it goes, and that's how your mind does it. All right. The other thing that hearing has been developed for is language. And Reid talks about the difference between an artificial language and a natural language. An artificial language, an example of an artificial language is English. Okay? Because yo puedo hablar en esta lengua y todas las palabras que yo estoy diciendo significan algo, aunque ustedes no entienden, right? So I just spoke Spanish, right? And I said, even though you guys can't understand me, all the words I'm saying mean something, okay? So we could use different signs, right? We could use a Spanish word instead of an English word to talk about the same thing, okay? So any sort of language that we Morse code is an example of artificial language. It's not a spoken language, hopefully, but it's, right? We can use that to communicate. But the only connection between the artificial language and the thing in the world is that we've all agreed that that's what it means, okay? We've all agreed that cat means a particular kind of something, and when we say cat, that's what we mean. He has this example about philosophers abusing language, and he says it's like philosophers switch the meaning of daughter and cow and then try to convince their neighbor that their daughter is their cow. That's not how it works. We agreed that this has to take place. Now, Reid posits an interesting argument. He says, look, we couldn't have artificial language unless we had natural language. We couldn't agree on stuff unless there was a way to agree on stuff prior to having developed the artificial language. So there are inherent human natural language, features of language, that mean what they mean regardless of who it is, right? These are things like facial expressions, how rapidly we do gestures and things, right? Dogs react to us because we're more aggressive or whatever. And these are things that we all understand, and we don't have to be sort of enculturated into an artificial language in order to understand them. Okay? All right. So we will come back to this idea of language in a second. Let's talk about touch. So the first thing that Reid talks about when he talks about touch is he talks about hot and cold. Okay? If I stick my hand over a fire, I feel a particular sensation, right? Like we've seen with all these other things, we know the difference between the sensation of sweet smelling and hot, right? It's sort of a weird thing. Like we process a lot of complicated stuff, but we know what hot is. Now, the issue with hotness, oh look, this kind of looks like heat. The issue with heat is I don't know what heat is. All I know about heat is it's the thing that makes me feel this particular way, which I call heat. Now, when we talk about things, that's how we talk about it. Philosophers have come along and they've said, there is no heat in fire. Right? This is part of the ideal system. There is no heat in fire. It's only in your mind. Okay, but when people say heat, what they mean is whatever is making my hand hot. Okay? Don't call my cow my daughter my cow, right? Don't just switch what you mean by words. Okay? So we have the same ambiguity of language, but whereas in the other instances we sort of have this vague notion that there's like effluvia, right? There's like something, or the sound waves, right? We don't know what the thing in the heat is that makes my hand hot. But whatever that thing is, that's what we mean when we talk about heat. Which means that we have names for things we don't know. Right? We don't know what heat is. He says, science might come along someday and tell us that heat is the vibration of certain parts, or it might tell us that it's some very, what does he say? Very subtle, a very subtle sort of substance that's in everything. But it doesn't matter, because when philosophers say there is no heat in the thing, they're not talking about what we're talking about when we're talking about heat. Whatever it is, that's what we mean. Okay? The same really could be said of smell and sound or whatever. If it turns out that our model of, sound waves and electromagnetic whatever, if all of that fell apart, that wouldn't freak the vulgar out, right? Those of us, when we talk about sound, we know what we mean by sound. However it works, however that thing is getting to my ear, what I'm talking about is the thing that's causing me to hear something. However that works out mechanically. Okay? So he points out here that this is an obvious place where it is clear that we don't know what this thing is, and yet we talk about it in a meaningful way, because whatever it is, it's causing me to sense heat. Okay. All of these various sensations that I'm having, whether it's smell or taste or hearing or touch, all of these things, in addition to creating my belief that I'm having a sensation, my belief that there's something that's causing the sensation, they suggest to me that I have a mind, that I am the object, or I am the subject that is having these thoughts. if you have this ideal system, you somehow have to reason your way from these disparate ideas, and you have to line them up and make them, and you get that sense of self, right? Hume's going to come along and say, well, where's your impression of self? You never have that. You have impressions of, pain or motion, you're moving, you feel like you're moving, or you have you feel like those things are connected, but how are you going to prove that? And Reid says, well, I don't, because everything that we've been talking about just suggests to me that I'm a me, and that I'm the one the stuff is happening to. And I can't argue for it more than that, If I actually didn't believe that I was a me, it doesn't matter how much logicking you did to me, right? He has this great line, wouldn't you treat a friend of yours who thought his example of a crazy person is someone who thinks they're made of glass? If your friend thought he was made of glass, wouldn't you treat him by physic and regimen, right? Diet and exercise, rather than logic and metaphysic, right? You can't treat someone whose common sense is broken with more logic. The guy who can't image isn't going to suddenly start imaging because you explain it better to him. Dr. Saunderson is not going to perceive color because you talk to him a lot, right? They're original principles of how we operate in the world. And we can't help doing it if we're healthy. We can't help just being commonsensical if we're healthy. And if we're broken, then we hope for some other solution. Hopefully these are things that can get resolved or compensated for at worst, right? Unfortunately, some people end up not being able to overcome those, and we try to take care of them as best we can. Okay, so now I want to do an experiment. You can use the chair in front of you. I want you to touch the chair in front of you. Okay? What is that chair like? Anybody?
Hard, not soft.
Hard, not soft. Okay. What is the sensation you have when you touch the chair? Touch is one of the most complicated things, says Reid, for us to sort of separate out when we are attending to the sensation versus when we're attending to the cause of the sensation. Right? If I push my hand against the table, like immediately I go, the table's hard. I don't think about this thing that's happening to my fingers and the pads of, right? It's a very bizarre thing. And this is a way that that natural language enters into the discussion once again. Because I am so constituted by my Creator that when I touch a hard thing, I have some sensation that I completely ignore in order to tell that this table is hard. Similarly, when we deal with artificial languages. Okay, you ready, guys? This is going to be weird. You don't think about how much I'm using my lips and teeth and tongue until I draw attention to it, and then it's really weird, right? You totally ignore, okay, stop it. You totally ignore the words that are coming out of my mouth, and you're just trying to understand what I'm saying. In artificial language, we pass through the sign to get to the signified. Similarly, in all these cases, but touch it's so hard to get the difference between touch and what we're actually feeling about the thing, that it's obvious that we're totally ignoring the sign to get to the signified. It's hard. But it's clear that the sensation is still different from the thing. Imagine, for instance, that I picked up this chair and walloped Bob over the head. He would feel a pain in his head, as we say, as the vulgar say. Is there pain in the chair? No. That's like an absurd thing to say, okay? So pain is clearly something that happens in my mind, even though it's caused by me walloping Bob with the chair, right? But similarly, this sensation I'm having when I'm pressing on the table is also a sensation, but I totally ignore the sensation to get to the thing that it signifies, okay? And we do this in all instances of all of the things we've talked so far, but it's just more obvious with touch. Now, here's the thing. The theory of ideas has an idea that Reid thinks is at the root of the whole thing, which is this idea of resemblance. And I'll try to explain what this is. If we follow what we've said so far, we can conclude that there is no necessary connection between the sensations that I have in my mind and the things that are out there in the world. And as soon as I told the high schoolers that, they were like, we can't know anything. And Reid is saying, no, that's not true. Why? Why is it the case that if the thing that you are experiencing, if the sensation is unlike the thing out in the world, that you're not experiencing the world? Why is that the case? That's just an assumption, okay? It's a long-held assumption. You can trace it back to Aristotle, but it came back with these guys. And the idea is, if the thing that's in my mind is not like the thing out there in the world, then I'm not interacting with the world. But that's just not true. There's nothing in this sensation that's like hardness. Why couldn't we get the sensate? Why couldn't we sense hardness through smell? Right? We get into some weird alien thing, right? Sci-fi alien things, right? But they can like hear, they can like hear, like, why can't you get the different sensations in different ways? You can't, there's no logical necessity to the way that my touch or my hearing or my smell, there's no logical reason for those to necessarily be connected to the things that they are, except that when I touch things, they are hard. And when I smell things, they smell sweet or putrid, right? The things are necessarily connected naturally. That's why they're in natural language. I get to the thing that's signified through the sign. And there's no necessary connection, just like in English. But it doesn't matter because I still interact with the thing. I know that this thing is hard because I know it's right, because it feels hard. And this is the thing that's in touch particular, and one of the reasons why it ends up being so complicated is we do say I smell a smell, but I don't say I hard a hard, right? We don't use language for the touch sensations. We don't even have words for touch sensations, except pain, right? There are a couple, right? But most of the time when we're interacting with something hard, roughness, smoothness, right? We have words for what those things mean in the world, what the object is, but we don't have words for the sensations themselves, right? I have a smell in my head to the smell out in the world. We have that language, but I have a touchy, you don't have, it's a roughness. Like we don't have language for it. Because we just skip over it so quickly that that we just ignore it. And this has come to be a problem for certain philosophers like Berkeley. Berkeley has this experiment. Okay, stick your hand over fire, put your hand in a bucket of ice. There's a bucket of room temperature water. Okay, stick your hands in it. Which one is it? Well, one of them is going to be cold and one of them is going to be hot, so it must be all be in your mind. And Reid says, no, come on, we know that the defect must be with your sensing stuff and not with the temperature of the water, right? The sensations, you've so conflated the sensation that you're having with whatever it means that you can't separate heat and heat like we do in almost every other case. All right. So we've gone through these 4 senses, and now we have to talk about sight. you would think with sight that now we're getting to the spot where we're actually dealing with stuff and not with sort of sensations that, doesn't sight resemble the things that are out there in the world? Well, it doesn't. Okay? So if you think about your field of vision is a sphere. Okay? Right? Because your eyes are circular and the surface on which things happen is rounded. Let's ignore for a second that you have two eyes, and so you have to negotiate that, and then the image is upside down because of refraction, and let's ignore all that stuff. Let's just think for a second about the orb of your vision, okay? That means that when you look at this triangle, all right, I should have drawn this with a ruler, all right, but this is roughly a right triangle, right? And the angles are adding up to, anybody, Euclid people? Okay, so the sum of two right angles. Two right 90-degree angles. But here's the problem. You don't actually see a 90-degree triangle. The surface, right, you see an orb. So in fact, when you look at this, it's ever so slightly, right? It's ever so slightly like this, and ever so slightly like this, and ever so slightly like this. Guess what? The angles add up to less than 90 degrees. Right? Visually. But you don't care, because you're not interested in actually looking at the thing. You're interested in figuring out what right triangles do mathematically. Right? And so we can deal with tangible triangles, says Reid, right? This is what a perfect right triangle in existence would be tangible, right? We could feel that it was the sum of two 90-degree angles. But visually, we don't perceive it as two right angles. We have this slight rounded thing going on. But it doesn't matter. Because, again, we ignore the sign and go to the signified. Let me ask you guys, what color are these chairs? They're green. Would you turn the lights off? Or just that light off? What color is this chair? It's still green. If you were going to draw this chair in Photoshop, would you use the same swatch on this chair right now as, turn the light on, this chair right now? No, you would not. Who cares? It's green, right? Because you're going through the sign to get to the signified, right? You're not interested in, P978 dash whatever, right? You don't care. We don't have, it's so unimportant to us that we don't have that specific of a difference of greens. I know that chair is the same green whether it's pitch black in here or not, right? Because I'm ignoring my perception, my direct perception of things, and I'm moving right to what the thing is. Okay, so how do we wrap this up? Well, if we recall, the whole problem came back to this robot in a trench coat, which is a euphemism for the sun going around us, right? We thought for so long that the sun was going around us, and then we figured out that that's not the case, and now how can we know anything? And Reid's saying, look guys, it's okay. You've spoken French, Latin, right? For us, it's English. Your whole life. Has anybody purposefully ever lied to you in English? Yeah, right? We've all experienced people lying, people fudging, people, conveniently painting facts in such a way that we didn't get mad at them when they were at fault, right? And yet, for some reason, we think English is still a valid medium in which to, operate in our lives. But people lie in English, right? You not just misunderstandings, people outright change what's happening with words. Okay? Nature never deceives us. Right? God has so made the universe, there is such order to the universe that God has made, that nature isn't out there trying to lie to us. Now, we may misunderstand her, right? We've been misunderstanding that the sun is going around us. But if we step back, if we look at it, if we contextualize, if we look at the situation a different way, just like how you would resolve a misunderstanding with a person speaking English, right? You can come to understand that, in fact, it wasn't lying, right? You just misunderstood. And if you're going to still, traffic in English or Latin or French, whatever language, you speak over here, if you're a philosopher, if you're still going to use words to try to do stuff, aren't you crazy to think that you can't interact in your natural language? Like, wouldn't it take an insane person to, continue doing the thing that people lie in, but you're not going to do the thing where the only thing that can go wrong is you misunderstand? That's a crazy person. So, that's Reid's Inquiry into the Human Mind and the Principle of Common Sense. I intended to give you more time for questions, but I have a few quick notes. And then I'll give you less time for questions, but still some time. Okay, why does this matter to us as Christians? It is my understanding of the Bible that the Bible is presenting to you something that you can come to commonsensically. You just do history with the Bible in the way that you always do history. You interact with language coming out of the Bible in the way you always interact with language. Now, it's very difficult, it's very complicated, but it's not unreachable because we know how language works. And if we don't understand how language works, we can go watch some people use language for a while and learn how language works. We know how history works. And if we don't, we can go figure it out. And we just have to do the same thing we do when we're trying to understand the works of nature, our own mind, when we are studying the Bible. So getting a handle on Reid's ideas and how belief and natural signs, how all of that works, is important for us to take seriously because this is how we really operate. And at the very least, the commitment to living in the world as it is, right? Living in reality is what's important. Ultimately, that is an existential sort of exercise, right? If you need to get an argument that convinces you that you remember stuff, you should see somebody, right? But if you need to be argued into a principle of common sense, I can't do it, right? And if you're doing that and you're not insane, you're pretending. But we know from the Bible that people often pretend things in order to avoid dealing with reality, right? People loved the works of the creation rather than the creator. And this led to all sorts of depravity. And people will feign not to understand, that this is how language works, or this is how, sensation, or the fact that I know that I exist, or that I'm responsible, right? People will feign any sort of thing in order to avoid the responsibility they have to their creator. So, I was going to talk about how this meshes with Jack's idea of Christian idealism. If you really want to know about that, we'll leave that to the questions. And if you have other questions on what I've talked about, I'm sorry this was it felt a little bit helter-skelter. But if you have questions about anything I've talked about or the implications of this or whatever, criticisms, objections, etc., now is the time.
Now I get it. This was good. The implications of this are life and death. Literally, life and death. And I still think they're pretending. I do not think Hume and Locke honestly thought that.
Oh, yeah.
I think they were trying to use an artificial language to escape the natural truth, personally. I could be wrong.
Well, and Reid notes as much about Hume. He says, he goes for half a dozen pages in believing in his own skepticism, but then, alas, he must bow to the vulgar. You know, like, he just, like, it's just constant. Like, you can't get away from it. It's how you do stuff. And if you didn't do stuff this way, we'd put you away and you wouldn't be a published author. And he's, you know, so
Here's the thing. You know what synesthesia is?
is that where you perceive sound as color?
Yeah, in the
It's some kind
synesthesia, the sensory input comes in, and then all the wires are in a glass of salt water, and then you have all these wires coming out, and there's no telling what comes out the other end, right? It's just the wires get crossed, okay? So if I go, dun, 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 you think Beethoven's Fifth, right? Everybody picked up on that. Except for the guy with synesthesia. They go, what's burning?
Right.
Right? Or pretty colors.
Right.
But the vulgar, which is Latin for commonplace or common,
Right.
the vast majority of people in the room go, no, honey, it's Beethoven's Fifth. It's
Right.
put your hand on the floor and feel the dun 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 dun, and if that's intact, they go, oh, my ears are lying to me.
Yeah.
Right? My wires are crossed. So we live in a world now where people will get up and go, that's too bad. She can't hear Beethoven's Fifth. And everybody goes out of the room feeling sorry for her because we, the common people, know. Now, I'm going to say one thing, okay? It's going to gender. Okay, this is where this comes. Nature never lies to us. The creation is true, right? We are the liars. So when we hear Beethoven's Fifth, and someone demands that that's burning chocolate,
Right.
why aren't we allowed? We should feel sorry for them.
Right.
Okay, I mean that's the implications of what Reid is talking about. And as I was reading up on him to come here, I just he's reacting to something. He's defending something. This is it.
Yeah. It's tricky to move from this idea of common sense to how then do we do like a common sense informed philosophy, because it's so easy to bring your taken for granteds into the thing. I mean, this was the issue in the dialogue leading up to the Civil War, is everybody just thought, oh yeah, like what I think is common sense. And it's really tricky to get around that. And in fact, there were a group of theologians that came out of Princeton. I think it's, can you help me here, Ron? B.B. Warfield and Hodge. There are various theologians from the Presbyterian tradition, and Reid was a Presbyterian himself, but who were trying to sort of argue out of this foundation of common sense. And it's not so clear that this is going to be grounds on which you're like, here's my theology. This is sort of like, okay, I can understand the Bible, so now I have to go like figure out how reading works. And it's like its own science that you have to sort of learn and become proficient in order to sort of derive your thing. So I think there has been some historical impetus to sort of take this and be like, here's the implication. But yeah, I think that if we are not going out and looking at the thing, then we're just making stuff up. And that's Reid's whole thing, is like, even with your own mind, you can't just make stuff up. You gotta go reflect on it. You gotta watch what you do. You gotta pay attention to how you actually work stuff out in the world. And that's really important. And it does have implications for things like gender and how science enters into that discussion and so on. Yeah, Ron.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
You know this is true. Hume was quite willing to, I mean, in writing his philosophy, at the end of it, he says, I'm sitting in my study and I'm thinking all these things, and this is, this is the way you have to think about it. But then I leave my study and I go and eat a sandwich, and now I'm going to forget. I mean, now I'm going to live as if, cause and effect is true, and, all of that stuff is happening. But the interesting thing, I mean, I am not a student of philosophy, so I don't want to oversimplify this because I could easily do that, but it is interesting that the thought, Hume's thinking about this stuff, a lot of the way that it's significant to us as Christians is that it brought a skepticism into it that was included skepticism about the existence of God. That given all of this stuff, I really can't have any confidence. You can't ask me to believe in God. I mean, essentially what it comes down to is I can show you that you don't have the justification to ask me to believe in God, because look at all of this stuff that's involved here. So I just always thought it was interesting when he steps out of the study, he goes and eats a sandwich and he gets back into the real world, but the thing that he leaves in the study is, I still don't have to believe in God. I mean, so the part of these esoteric discussions, they do really come back to fundamental questions about what am I obligated to do? That is, all these epistemological questions, about warrant and all of this stuff, it comes back to, do I actually have realities communicated to me such that I have to deal with them and I have to do something about them? And it's easy for this sort of philosophy to end up going in that direction where somehow or another I've kind of implied that you don't have the right to tell me that I ought to believe something or that I ought to do something. So,
and I think it's important in that connection to recognize this thing about heat and heat, right? Like, I don't know what's causing the heat in the fire, right? Science, like, we may get to a spot, like we may actually produce a science that tells me what that heat is, right? But the issue is the sort of vulgar notion of that cause out there, whatever it is, isn't harmed by fashions of science, right? So at one time we had the idea that there's this substance that's coming out of stuff, right? And now we have this sort of quantum electromagnetic vibrational thing, right? And it's like, it doesn't matter what your explanation ends up being because we're not talking about that explanation. We're saying there's something it doesn't matter. However it works, that's what it is. And this I think is how you think about Reid's discussion in the context of Jack's idealism, right? Most of you were here when he talked about that. It may end up being the case that as God's sort of putting together the universe, that there is in fact a new moment being created every moment, right? But we need to be talking about what we're talking about. If I'm talking about heat, don't pretend I'm talking about your scientific cause explanation, okay? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about whatever it is that's making me warm, okay? And it's important as a philosopher not to say, cause and effect doesn't really exist. And Hume is right in that sense because he means something very specific and very logical. Who could ever prove it anyway? And Reid's like, we're not talking about that, right? I'm like, I can get the cue ball to hit the other cue ball in the pocket. That's all I mean by cause and effect. I can make the thing happen. Now, whether God is actually, he uses language like, if God is using the occasion to do whatever, I don't know. Who knows? It's like a huge mystery. Maybe we do need revelation to resolve some of those issues. But that's not what we're talking about most of the time. And don't pretend like you're talking about what we're talking about when you change, daughter to cow and then try to tell me, right? That's an abuse of language. Don't do that. Live in reality. And part of reality is talk to me about what I'm talking about. Don't change the thing and just make words mean what they don't. Because then you are lying in artificial language. All right. I hope that was helpful. Do go read this. It's a really good book. And you can, there is a simplified version on early modern texts. He updates some of the language. It's not as pretty, but you can sort of get to his argument. I think Wikipedia has this online library called Wikisource, and you can get the full text of the inquiry on there as well, if you don't mind sort of scrolling on and reading on a computer screen. So, all right. Thank you, guys.